Now, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we have Raiden up here who's going to give us God's message this morning. So please welcome Raiden.
Good morning, Renfrew Baptist Church. As I was so appreciate, I've just been introduced there. Me and my dad today have switched roles. As you can see, he lead in worship, and today I am following in his footsteps and going to do the preach for today. Most of you guys know me. I'm Raiden Luse. If you don't know me, I'm Raiden Luse. Nice to meet you. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what normally goes on in RBC. We're going to be, over the next 3 weeks, going through a topical sermon series on how to read the Old Testament. So when I was first getting into my Bible, I found that I just wanted to start right at the start. And as some of you guys may know, starting right at the very start in Genesis can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And as I continued to work through my Bible and read more of the Old Testament, I found that I was having quite a lot of trouble with it. It didn't quite read like Harry Potter. I found that the characters were underdeveloped. There was almost no description of any kind. All the scenery and settings seemed kind of flat. And the story chugged along with a speed that didn't seem to make any sense. And that led to me reading long passages of Leviticus with my eyes sort of glazed over, being like, what am I even reading at this point? I swear I just read this a couple of chapters ago. And honestly, this way of reading the Old Testament, while I got more familiar with the story and how it worked, I never quite figured out what was going on. And then, in my second year of university, I'm a university student. I study up at St. Andrews, and I'm currently taking English Literature and Biblical Studies, working on my Hebrew currently. I took a course by this guy called Bill Tuman on how to read the Old Testament. And it entirely changed how I viewed these sets of books, and it entirely changed how I read the Old Testament. It actually made me a lot more excited about it, because I realized that while these stories are not similar to our stories today, they do have their own unique way of drawing you in and really grabbing your attention. It's just sometimes hard for us modern readers to get. So these next 3 sermons are just going to be me sharing what I've learned. I'm essentially condensing down a lot of lectures into 3 sermons in the hopes that I'll be able to, again, share some of what I've learned and give you guys some tools for reading the Old Testament. And this is going to be said, like I said, split up into 3 parts. Today we're going to be going over the basics of the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. Next week we're going to be looking at narrative techniques to know about. So what are the tools that the biblical authors are using to draw you in and to grab your attention and to communicate ideas? And then we're going to be reading the story of Samson together, incorporating everything we've learned over the past 2 weeks and applying it to a biblical story that I imagine most of us are familiar with, right? Big, strong Samson. In this particular sermon, we're going to be, like I said, going over the basics of how to get into the Hebrew Bible, and then we're going to be doing like a 15-minute quick blast through the entire story, just summarizing the whole thing to give you guys an idea of where we're at, what is the Old Testament about, and kind of, give some context for the next couple of sermons. These sermons are going to be less theological. They're going to be less me interpreting the text and more lecture style, I guess, because that's kind of where I'm coming from, is a lecture university background. So, first of all, why should you even care about any of this stuff? Why care about how the story looks overall, or why care about knowing the basics? And I would say that a big part of that is that the Hebrew Bible is not at all linear. So stories do not show up in a chronological fashion. You have stories from all over Israel's history, and you have a mishmash of settings, usually sometimes in one book, especially prophecy, can be absolutely crazy. So having a good grounding in Israelite biblical history can kind of help you keep your footing when you're reading through the Bible and trying to figure out, okay, what is this psalm about? What is this prophet talking about? Are we pre-exile, post-exile? Like, what's going on? And as well as that, the history of Israel is really foundational to the New Testament authors. And while this series is going to be on the Old Testament, a lot of the things that we're going to learn about will help you when you're reading your New Testament. So, what is the Hebrew Bible? The Hebrew Bible is basically a bunch of books written across the course of Israel's history by different people and at different times. It's got a bunch of different genres in it as well. You've got poetry, prose, and what I mean by prose is like stories or narratives. You've got prophecy, and today we're going to be specifically looking at narrative prose. But as I mentioned earlier, this is also going to help you when you're reading poetry and when you're reading prophecy. What the Hebrew Bible is meant to do or what it's for is quite hard to pin down, but in part, it chronicles the history of Israel and their relationship with the God called Yahweh. Another really important thing to know about the Hebrew Bible is that it's written in Hebrew, which honestly, while it might seem kind of obvious, it can be really easy to forget that sometimes because we're so blessed to have an amazing plethora of English translations that will give us different aspects or different meanings of the text. But the fact that our Old Testaments are not written in English is actually really important and can really affect how we read some of these books. And we'll kind of get into that maybe next week of how language plays into reading our Old Testaments. As well as that, canon is something we have to talk about, or the order of our Bibles. Most of us, with our English Protestant Bibles, will have the exact same set of books as the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish scriptures. You may know some of our Catholic brothers and sisters have a slightly different canon. The reasoning for this is that around the Reformation period, 1500s, Luther decided that he was going to base his canon, which we would all go on then to use, off of the original Jewish canon as it was sort of established around the first couple centuries in the Common Era. And that's why, so we have the same books. They're sometimes counted a little bit differently because books like the minor prophets, so Joel, Amos, Obadiah, in the Hebrew scriptures, they're just lumped together as the book of the 12. So the counting is a little bit different. As well as that, there is a different structure to our English Bibles compared to Jewish scriptures. There's a different ordering. Can I get the next slide? Boom, there we go. We have the shape of our English Bibles. If this is a little hard to see, don't worry too much about it. It's not super important. But our English Bibles are structured according to genre, and they're structured chronologically. So as you can see, we've got narrative and history, and then we've got poetry or wisdom literature, and then we finish with prophecy. And our English Bibles, they're kind of structured the way that a librarian might structure the Bible. So something like the book of Ruth is a story, and it takes place in the time of the Judges. So in our English Bibles, Ruth comes right after Judges, which makes a lot of sense. However, the Hebrew scriptures, or Jewish scriptures, are not quite structured in the same way. Next slide. Boom. They're structured in three big sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And that translates to the law, the prophets, and the writings. And these are structured a little bit differently. My lecturer, Bill Tuman, all the slides in blue, by the way, are slides that I have just ripped from my lecturer, so it's kind of how you know what's him and what's me. He structured it in this way. So the Torah is God speaking. So God giving the Israelites the law, speaking to his people. And then the Nevi'im, the prophets, is people speaking for God. So people like Joshua speaking on behalf of God, or the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, speaking on behalf of God. And then the Ketuvim, the writings, are people speaking to or about God. The Psalms being like songs of praise to God. Obviously, not every book matches perfectly with this setup, but this is vaguely how it's structured. And so a book like Ruth, even though it's a narrative, and even though it takes place in the time of the Judges, it's not really about Israel's story or Israel as a people. It's trying to communicate a set of ideas. So instead, it's placed in the Ketuvim. It's placed in the writings, along with wisdom literature like Proverbs or the Psalms. So why does this order even matter? You might be wondering, like, what is the point? What is the difference in how we read these? And just to give you an example, next slide, the Eshet Chayil translates to the strong woman or a woman of strength. And in Proverbs 31, there is a poem about what you should look for in an ideal wife. And it's all about the idea of this Eshet Chayil, this strong woman or this woman of valor. And the Eshet Chayil is depicted as someone who is quite wealthy, someone who has nice cloth that they can spin for their children, someone who is fiscally wise, knows when to buy a field and when not to. The Eshet Chayil's husband sits in the city gates, which is a metaphor meaning that her husband is one of the elders of the city. And overall, the Eshet Chayil in Proverbs 31 is a very affluent person. And in some orderings of the Hebrew Bible, Ruth does not come after Judges, it comes directly after Proverbs, which creates an interesting link when we look in Ruth chapter 3, Boaz calls Ruth an Eshet Chayil. And this is a really big deal because Ruth is actually not at all similar to what we find in Proverbs 31. Ruth is not affluent. She is not a Jew or an Israelite. She has no husband at the beginning of the story and no family to speak of apart from her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth actually has to go into other people's fields to pick grain just to help them survive. And when we think about Ruth as a character, we can really understand how she might be thought of as an Eshet Chayil, a strong woman, even though she's really dissimilar to the Eshet Chayil in Proverbs 31. So this ordering of the books might be a way of trying to expand our definition of what does it mean to be an Eshet Chayil, what does it mean to be a strong woman. And so the order that we read can really affect the meaning or the particular points that are emphasized or drawn out. Now, the next slide is going to be basically bullet points of the entire story of Israel. We're going to transition into trying to blitz through this as quick as possible to give you guys a bit of grounding on what the story is in the Hebrew Bible. If you cannot see this, that is okay. This is more if you wanted to take a photo. What is really handy about it is that it has all the dates. So if you're a history buff and you like knowing when exactly things happened, then this might be handy. I'm terrible with dates. So I've just, again, stolen that slide and put that up there. If you want to be sent that after, you totally could, if it's something that interests you. So launching into the story, the first foundational story of Israel is the story of Abraham, who is one of the patriarchs or the fathers of Israel. God shows up to him and establishes a covenant with Abraham, saying that he's going to create a nation through him who will be God's chosen people. Oh, I forgot about this slide. This is a map. It's a very cluttered map, and so I decided to add some visual clarity by drawing a big red circle, lots of arrows, and a little guy pointing at the Levant, which is Israel and Palestine today. Again, if you're a map guy, knowing actually ancient geography can be quite helpful. I'm not a map guy, but I think it's kind of fun anyway. Anyway, as I was saying, Abraham, God chooses to establish a covenant with him, and this covenant evolves throughout the course of the Bible, but as we can see, the first condition that God gives Abraham is go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So these first promises that God gives to Abraham are that he's going to have a son, that he's going to create a nation through him, and that he's going to lead him to the promised land of Canaan. All Abraham has to do is he has to get up from Ur of the Chaldeans, and he has to move to Canaan. I think I have another map showing where Abraham goes. He goes from Ur, and then he goes right over there. I didn't draw any helpful circles for you because I figured you guys probably have the picture by now. However, while this is the original stipulation, is all Abraham has to do is get up and go, over the course of the Hebrew Bible, the covenant is going to evolve and it's going to change, and it's going to include more things like the law, the Torah, the different codes that the ancient Israelites were told to follow by God. A bunch of stuff happens. Abram has a son called Isaac. Isaac has a son called Jacob. There's this really cool story where Jacob literally wrestles with God, and he gets renamed to Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. From here on out, the nation is now named after Jacob, or his new name, Israel. and the people group become labeled one who wrestles with God, which again, as we're going to see throughout this story, is a very apt name for God's chosen people, because they're kind of constantly in a tug of war, and Israel's never quite doing what they're meant to be doing, and God's always pestering them and being like, please, I just want to love you, I want to stop punishing you, please stop wrestling with me. And then Joseph shows up, the son of Jacob. And Joseph's story should be pretty familiar to most of us, right? His brothers sell him into slavery, and then he, through God's blessing, he becomes the second-hand man to Pharaoh. And when there's a famine, there's some identity shenanigans, and then it's like, hey, he gets reunited with his brothers. He brings his whole family out of Canaan, and he brings them to Egypt. Joseph's brothers and Joseph's two sons then become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. You just can vaguely hang on to those names because they're going to be important because, again, like I said, they're going to be the new tribes of Israel. So Joseph, through a series of trickery, because he's the one in charge, he has all the food, he essentially enslaves all the Egyptians in exchange for food. He takes their land, he takes their cattle, and then he takes themselves in exchange for all the food that Joseph has. Then there's this reversal where after quite a long time, Joseph is dead. The Pharaoh who was favorable towards the Israelites is dead. New Pharaoh in charge enslaves them all because he's scared of them. And this is when the second foundational story of Israel happens, right? Moses is chosen to lead Israel out of Egypt. And like I said, this is a super important story. All throughout your Bibles, you're going to see references to God being the God who brings his people up out of Israel. So really important story here for Israel's history. He leads them out of Egypt, but Moses has quite a hard time. He often has to wrestle with Israel as well, because, like I said, Israel's not a very fun people to try and manage. In Numbers 11:11, Moses says to God, "Why have you treated your servants so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me?" Then the Israelites, in another sort of wrestling match with God, are told to invade the land of Canaan. And they send some spies in to check it out. The spies get super scared. They come back and they're like, guys, we cannot take on the Canaanites. They're way too big for us. And this causes everyone to get afraid, and no one wants to invade. God tells them again, and they're just like, nope. So they get hit with a plague. And then God tells them that they're going to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the entire generation of adults dies off. And their children are going to be able to inherit the land. Moses as well, he doesn't even get to see the promised land because he made a mistake at the waters of Meribah. It's a little bit unclear what the mistake was, but he did something wrong. So he also doesn't get to see the promised land, which is a bit of a shame. Then Joshua takes over from Moses and leads Israel to conquer many of the peoples in the promised land. He is sort of like Moses 2.0, but more military oriented. He talks less to God, and he does more, like I said, military conquests. And in Joshua 3:7, the Lord says to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses." Later in that same chapter, God parts the river Jordan so that the Israelites can cross on dry land. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah? A little bit on it. Kind of like Moses parting the Red Sea. This is showing us that God is with Joshua in the same way that he was with Moses. Like I said, Joshua gets into the land. He conquers some of the peoples that he's meant to, but he leaves a lot of people, a lot of natives there that he's not really meant to. So he does a mixed job, but overall, Joshua does a pretty good job as a leader. The next part of the story takes place in Judges, where the people of Israel are they're established in the land, they've got control of it, and they're now trying to figure out how to govern themselves without any centralized government, right? There's no king, there's no one really in charge. And it's sort of a downward spiral into disaster. The book of Judges is cyclical, so it moves in cycles, but it's not quite a cycle like a circle. It's a cycle like a spiral, like I said, down into disaster. And it starts with the people turning away from God. They get punished by God because their enemies oppress them. Then they cry out to God for help. God sends them a judge who delivers them, and they have peace, usually for as long as that judge is alive. But then once the judge dies, they get complacent, they turn away from God, turn to idols, and the whole cycle starts all over again. And there's this repeated line about the judges, and it's like, so the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. And this happens usually when the judges, towards the end of the judge's story. And as you can see, I've listed the years of peace that occur during every judge's reign. And they start quite good with 40 years, 80 years, 40 years, 40 years, and then they start to sort of trickle downwards. You get 20 years, and then you get 6 years of peace, 7, 10, 8, and then Samson finishes with a little bit more at 20. So as you can see, even like the years of peace, the numbers in this book are indicating this slow downward spiral into disaster. And it seems like whatever system they've got in place is just not working. And there's this other repeated refrain. And it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And this line, every time it crops up, is meant to point forward to the book of Kings. It's setting up the reader to wonder, okay, this judges thing is not working. We clearly cannot govern ourselves. Maybe the answer is a king. Maybe the answer is some form of centralized government. Spoiler alert, this is not the answer. The monarchic period of Israel, so the period where they do kings, doesn't actually start in the book of Kings. It starts with the book of Samuel, who is the prophet that anoints the first king. And Samuel is telling the people, stop asking for a king. This is a bad idea. You don't want a king. The people are like, no, we really do want a king. And God is like, Samuel, relax. Just give it to them, okay? And so Samuel's like, all right, fine. Give you a king. And he anoints Saul. Saul does an okay job at the start, but he ends up being a bit rubbish. If you know his story, he's not the nicest guy in the world, and he doesn't quite follow the law in the way he's meant to. But then David comes in to replace him, and David is a much better substitute. My lecturer said that David is kind of the highest that things get in terms of Israel trying to govern themselves. He's the closest to get to doing a good job, and he is the Israelites' golden boy. He shows up all over the Hebrew Bible, and he's generally one of these guys who's like in a cast of really not great characters. David is a good one. He's a good king. He rules in Jerusalem, which is the capital of Judah. And even though he generally does a really great job throughout his reign, still in the end, he kind of goes out with a fizzle rather than a bang. He has that moment with Bathsheba where he exploits her and then also murders her husband in the same breath. And that is pretty bad. And then he's also not great with managing his children. His son almost usurps him without him even knowing because he's so old and frail. And through, what seems to be sheer luck and the wisdom of his wife Bathsheba, he manages to get his son Solomon on the throne. And Solomon does an okay job in terms of following up. At first, he does a really great job because he builds the first temple. And this is super important because this is the center of religious activity or the center of cultic activity. And what I mean when I say cultic is like ritual activity, so sacrifices and incense offerings, things like that. And as well as that, the temple was thought to be the place where God dwelled. It was where his presence was. Obviously, in the Old Testament, we have the idea that God is kind of everywhere, or he has power outside of his own land, which in ancient times is a weird idea. It's weird for a god to have power outside of their land. But the temple was where he was especially, or where his presence was in a special way. And so that was really awesome. But then Solomon's reign, he also doesn't do a great job. The Bible cites his main problem as he had way too many wives that eventually led him to idolatry. And there's a couple other hints throughout his story that he's maybe not the most fantastic king. As well as that, he clearly has not done a great job of raising his children either, because his son Rehoboam does a terrible job. It's just like seconds from when he is crowned king, he causes a giant schism in Israel. He causes the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom to fracture entirely. The tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and some of the tribe of Levi remain loyal to the house of David. They remain loyal to Rehoboam, and they stick in the southern part of Israel. But the other 10 tribes, they go off, and I think Jeroboam is the one that leads them. And this fracture, from here on out, the northern kingdom is called Israel, and the southern kingdom is called Judah. This is pretty important for the story going forward, knowing these names and understanding that after Solomon, there's a big split between Israel's tribes. And after this, to be honest, the kings just keep getting worse. It's another downward spiral into disaster. Israel is constantly getting bullied by their enemies. There's a couple high points with like decent kings, but for the most part, it's disaster. Manasseh is a king, and he's like the lowest that things get. Just all around terrible guy, child sacrifice levels of terrible, idolatry levels of terrible. He sets up a foreign idol in the temple proper, which is just a huge no-go. And that's when God finally decides that he has had enough. These people are going to be exiled. They're going to be kicked out of the land. There's a couple more kings after Manasseh, so the story goes on for a bit, but that is the point where God is like, I've had enough. You guys are done. And after the schism between Judah and Israel, so Judah being the south, Israel being the north, Israel is generally depicted as being worse than Judah. They have less good kings, and their descent into evil and idolatry is like quicker than Judah's. And so Israel get exiled first. They are exiled by the Assyrians, who are kind of from up north. And 10 tribes of Israel get exiled, and the Assyrians, on purpose, split them up and put them in a bunch of different places so that they can never really get back together. And these tribes are wiped from history. They are gone for the entire story, basically. And then, let's see, around 100 years, oh wait, I've got a map. There we go, boom. The red line is Israel, the northern kingdom. They're getting exiled by the Assyrians. And then around 100 years later is the second exile, when the Babylonians come and they exile Judah, the southern kingdom. And they deport the upper class citizens, so the wealthy. But they leave a remnant, they leave some poor people there to tend the land. If you remember, we've been going through Habakkuk, and this is kind of where it's set, is Habakkuk is tense before the coming of the Babylonians who are going to exile the southern kingdom. They set up a puppet king called Zedekiah to sort of keep watch over Judah in the meantime. And after a little bit, Zedekiah, against the Lord's advice, decides that he's going to rebel against the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, does not take kindly to this. He comes back and immediately obliterates Judah, obliterates Jerusalem, and destroys the temple. This is another really big deal, the fact that the temple is gone. I think the map is back. Blue line, that's Judah. And they get exiled by the Babylonians, who are kind of more eastern way. So why is the exile so important? Because, guys, it's really important in terms of cultural trauma that affects the entire writing of the Bible, the entire way that it's edited together. A big part of why it's so important is because the temple gets destroyed. And if you remember, like I said, the temple is thought to be the place where God's presence was. And for a lot of ancient thinkers, if the temple of a god is destroyed, that means they've lost. That means they've been overcome by a foreign god, and they are like kind of gone, I guess you could say. Without the temple, what are you meant to do? Because that's where God lives. And so the biblical writers are wrestling with these issues of, where is God? Why did God allow us to lose? Did God lose? And what do we do now that we can't even follow the law anymore because so much of it relied on the temple being there, on ritual forms of worship? On top of that, they have to wrestle with whether or not they should assimilate into the cultures, into Babylonian culture. How much should they assimilate? What are they even meant to do? And like I said, the entire Bible, the way that it's edited together, is thinking about these questions. And it's thinking about why the exile happened and whether or not there's hope for restoration. Additionally, in exile is where book religion starts to develop a little bit more. So without the temple, you can't make sacrifices, and you can't take the temple with you. But a book, a set of holy scriptures, that's something you can take with you into exile. And so reading scripture becomes a lot more important in this time when they don't really have the prescribed forms of worship to rely on. The next part of the story is the return to Judah. So roughly around 50 years after the fall of Jerusalem, they get a chance to go back to the land. In the time in between now, the Persian Empire kicks off, and the Persians take over the Babylonians. And so when we're reading books written in exile, or like Ezra, Nehemiah, it's not Nebuchadnezzar who's in charge anymore, it's now Cyrus II, king of Persia. And he allows a group of people to go back to the promised land. And Ezra, he is the person who's in charge of them, and he leads in rebuilding the temple. And this is a really big moment for Israel, a really great comeback. We've got the temple up and running again. But while it's a great comeback, it's also a moment of real sadness. If you read that bit of the Bible, it says that there were big crowds of people and no one could tell who was laughing and who was weeping. And I think the idea is that the older folk who had seen the glory of the previous temple are weeping because this new one is so pitiful in comparison. Whereas the younger folk who don't remember that are just chuffed that we've got the temple back and that we're back in the promised land. So it's a bit of a mixed moment, I guess. And then Nehemiah comes back later on and he takes a team and he begins rebuilding the walls. And this is sort of when the Bible, the story ends. This is the sort of final note that we end on. If we fast forward in time to Jesus' day, around 70 AD, the temple gets destroyed again by the Romans. So that is sort of your look into the future. But the Hebrew Bible ends on this note with this sort of mixed moment of redemption. How are we all doing? I know that was a lot to go through. We just went through kind of the entire Bible in 15 minutes. I hope I'm not running too far over. Just want to draw out a couple main points from this. As you can see, the Hebrew Bible on the whole, as described by my lecture, is a tragedy. It is a fall from grace, and it's a very long and kind of prolonged fall from grace. It's just failure after failure after failure. And every time something's going right, it lasts like a mere moment, and then things fall apart again. It is not, the Old Testament is not a happy story. Thankfully for us as Christians, the Hebrew Bible is not where the story ends, which is really great. But if you're reading the Old Testament, it's good to keep in mind this general pattern of things kind of going downward. So, thank you guys very much for listening to me yap about the Old Testament. This is something that I find really interesting. If you guys have any questions or want to chat to me after, you can come talk to me, talk to one of the elders, and again, be more than happy to yap your ear off about these stories because they're really cool. Like I said, next week we're going to be looking a little bit more in detail at some stories and at some mechanics or literary devices that authors are going to use to grab our attention and to communicate meaning. For now, the band is going to come back up and we're going to have a time of worship. Communion is at that back table there if you want to take it. And also, I think someone will be through here in the back if you want prayer. Keith will be in the back if you would like prayer. All right, I'm going to pray real quick and then hand over to Pastor B. Dear God, thank you so much that we're able to spend this time together. Thank you so much that you have given us your holy word that we can read and that we can engage with and that we can enjoy. Thank you so much that your story does not end with the Old Testament. It does not end with the Hebrew Bible or with flawed characters like Ezra and Nehemiah. Thank you that you sent your son to die for us and to redeem this awful mess and this tragedy that we've gotten ourselves into. We love you so much, God. And we thank you that we're able to be here in this building, that we're able to worship, and that we have the Holy Spirit with us to guide us and to bring us joy. I just pray that you would send us out today with joy and with singing and not with tragedy lingering in our hearts. We love you, God. Amen.